Okay, so good afternoon. Welcome to, this is the 8th Digital Classicist seminar of summer 2018. We're extremely pleased this week to welcome Anshuman Pandey, who has a PhD in history from University of Michigan and is here to talk about the tensions of standardization and variation in the encoding of ancient scripts in Unicode.
Hello, I'm Anshuman Pandey. It's an honor for me to be here, and I've come a long distance to share my interest in digital classics and humanities, and particularly in Unicode and the encoding of ancient scripts. And I hope you'll forgive my errors throughout this presentation. And for those of you joining us on the YouTube broadcast, thank you for taking the time to listen. And if you're not listening at present, and at some time in the future, thanks for taking interest to find this channel and for expanding our interest and excitement in digital humanities and digital classics. Yeah. So, my talk is titled Tensions of Standardization and Variation in the Encoding of Ancient Scripts in Unicode. And the title is itself a variation on the theme of the seminar series, which was standardization, customization in digital classics. I took the liberty, and I hope that those in attendance will forgive me. About me, I come from academia, but also straddle industry, particularly modern big data analytics and machine learning. But before I started working for a fintech company, I did my PhD in history at the University of Michigan, focusing on South Asian history, and in particular in the emergence of literate cultures and societies with a sub-focus on writing systems. And after that, I went on to do a postdoc at the University of California, Berkeley in linguistics, and that position was funded by a Google Research Award. And my work there was primarily to expand the Unicode standard. And I currently spend time as a researcher for the Script Encoding Initiative at the University of California, Berkeley. And the key driver for all of my efforts in this area are to develop and use modern technologies to enhance digital humanities. And to me, my work in combining technology and scholarship is geared towards enabling digital humanities foundations. That is to make it possible for researchers to conduct digital studies of ancient texts, of modern texts, of any text in general. And my focus lie in 3 different areas. The first is representation of visible language. And by that, I mean script, writing system, alphabet, which are often ignored in traditional and applied linguistics and language studies. People tend to focus more on the actual linguistic content and not the medium in which it's transmitted. And the reason I have an interest in writing systems stems from my penchant as an historian, which is access and presentation of textual sources in the original. And I like to privilege and prioritize sources. And the way in which historians obviously deal with the past is through that written medium. Beyond the enabling of writing systems in computers, my interest also extends to allowing scholars, enabling scholars to input ancient languages and scripts by creating keyboards and other sorts of utilities that allow interaction with the computer system. And then the third thing, which is the most advanced aspect of my work, is developing natural language processing and machine learning tools that help us extract information and analyze text using programmatic methods. And the goal for me in doing all this work is at some point to have all languages be as natively digital as English is today. And so today, as part of my talk, I want to introduce you to what I consider to be the full stack of digital support for languages, which undergirds the whole notion of digital classics for humanities. And to me, it consists of these these primary aspects. But today I want to focus on script encoding. And as you can tell from this little excerpt of the stack here, you can see that Aramaic, which was an ancient script used in southwestern Iran, which is currently around the area of modern Kuwait, was not supported at all in Unicode, as opposed to, let's say, English. And Adlam, which is a newly invented alphabet used in Africa, has an encoding, but no other supplemental data, which enables scholars to actually make use of it properly in digital media. The digital humanities stack is basically conceived of largely in this sense, where computational thinking and knowledge representation kind of merge. And that allows us to develop research infrastructures, digital methodologies, metadata for cataloging, for annotating texts, all the way up to allowing us to do cultural and critical critiques, to use various tools and applications to make these texts alive to certain audiences, and then to publish about the work that we do. To me, script and character encoding are the foundation of this digital humanities stack. Without having an ability to represent language on computers, none of this is possible. And so for many of the languages of the world, in particular ancient languages, this aspect is absent. And so what is Unicode? I've mentioned this name quite a few times. But Unicode is an international character encoding standard for writing systems. It basically enables text to be uniformly shared in digital media, and it enables the input of textual content, the exchange or sending of data across devices, and the display. Put in simplest terms, anything that you see, view, type, even speak on your phone these days is all made possible because Unicode is there behind the scenes. And Unicode has transformed scholarship in global classics by providing for representation of text in the original writing systems. And in the last 5 years, we have encoded 50 new scripts, bringing the total to about 100 scripts. So Unicode has been significantly expanded in terms of its ability to cater to the needs of scholars around the world in terms of linguistic enablement, but also to preserve and to make it possible to use these languages and scripts to native audiences around the world. A lot of them belong to minority communities. So in Unicode, a script is defined as a sign system with defined rules. And the sign system consists of distinctive signs, which are called characters. This is very similar to the linguistic notion of a grapheme, but also very different from it in many cases. And each of these characters possess a unique semantic value, not phonetic, but a semantic textual value. And to put the code in Unicode, each are assigned a unique hexadecimal value. So that on a computer, every single character has a unique identifier which distinguishes it from all other characters in the standard. So encoding itself is defining a digital code for an analog sign. So let's take the letter A, for example. In Unicode, that is, capital letter A is given the sign with the digital code 0041. So whenever I type in an A in a text message or in an email message and I send it to somebody, my system is actually sending a hexadecimal code 0041 to the receiver. And that device is translating that into what we think of as an A. So the process for enabling the production of digital codes for analog signs, for all scripts in general, is to identify a repertoire of distinctive signs and variants, to establish representative glyphs for these signs, to generate a script grammar, and then a font to display the characters, and then an encoding model. So basically what we're doing is we're taking conventions for writing, language by hand, and developing ways for it to be typed. These are two different biomechanical and mental processes. And so there is a lot of technical infrastructure that goes into enabling this translation from writing into typing. And then along with that is the translation of qualitative data into technical metadata, which supports all of the linguistic infrastructure that we're creating. Now, all that's very dry and boring to a lot of people. Let me put it in simpler terms. So for the Latin script for English, we have A through Z. And each of these signs are distinctive in our alphabet. And we may have letters that look like this, an italic A, or a nice French-style bookhand A, or Times Roman A, or a fancier A. But these all represent the notion of A, and they have an A-ness, right, in a sense, right? And so, from the Unicode point of view, we consider them to be variants of an A. So when you type in A in Microsoft Word, for example, you'll see whatever your default font is, you'll see an A. But when you go and select that and change it to a different font, then all you're doing is just changing its representation, its variation, and not its actual standard form. So below any of these is still Latin capital letter A, no matter what. So if I were to copy and paste this into a different document, the underlying code is still 0041. That'll never change until someone replaces Unicode with something else. And the basis of all of this variation standardization is the character glyph model. So basically what we say is that this capital letter A is plain text. And these are non-plain text, or another way to say it is rich text. And that's where the tension lies to me, is that the tension of standardization and customization is embedded in the actual encoding process. Because the character encoding, the character glyph model produces a technical tension. That is, it encodes a normative or representative form of a sign as a character, but it defines other forms as glyphic variants. So standard versus variant, and plain text versus not plain text. And the mantra in Unicode is that Unicode encodes characters, not glyphs. So capital letter A, but not all those fancier italicized or bookhand forms. But the tension has these attributes, that the script itself may have historical, scribal, and stylistic variants. So at some point in the past, a particular style may have been conceived of as an independent script. Let's take Fraktur, for example, German black letter, which is unified with the basic Latin alphabet. Or maybe Irish uncial hands at some point were considered to be particular distinctive monastic styles and not maybe disconnected from the notion of a Latin alphabet in the sense of being an Irish hand. Also, considerable differences may exist between early and late forms of a script. When you look at script continua, where you have evolution of scripts, if the script in the middle is defined as a distinctive script, then what about those at the terminals? Would those be considered variations of an ancestor or a descendant, or part of the core script? And more importantly, graphically similar scripts may have structural differences. So a script may look the same at a surface level, but when you get down to the deep level, it's completely different in terms of its technical and orthographic aspects. I'll talk more about this with some examples. So the backstory, I was working, when I was doing my postdoc at Berkeley, I was working on various Iranian scripts. And I was working on something called the SIAC system, which was a numerical notation system that is believed to have been designed by Sasanian scribes right at the edge of the Arab invasion of Central Asia. And these scribes were able to take their knowledge of their own Iranian numerical system and the Arabic script to define ways of encoding numbers to prevent fraud. So instead of writing digits out, they had very stylistically specific shorthand for representing certain numbers. Like this would be the number 100. So if you were to write this down, you wouldn't be able to confuse that or to alter it to say 700 instead of 100, for example. But while I was doing this research, I came across the Sogdian script, a manuscript from Central Asia, and I had never heard of this before. And so then I did some more research and I discovered that there was an older Sogdian script. Now this is an ancient letter I'll talk more about this in a second. And then I was trying to figure out where these Sogdian scripts came from and the relationship to other scripts of Central Asia and Iran. I found a Khwarezmian script that was also used in the same area where these other scripts were used. So Sogdian, Khwarezmian were used in the area of modern-day Uzbekistan and around the Aral Sea area. And they may have belonged to a larger script continuum, but at some point, as I'll show, that they diverged into distinctive scripts. And so when I presented the abstract for this talk, I planned on talking about 3 different major script groups in an effort to ease this tension between standardization and variation. And those were the Egyptian hieroglyphs, Imperial Aramaic, and Greek. But after I talked to Valeria and asked how long the seminar is, thinking a seminar is actually like maybe 3 hours, she said 40 minutes. And so I said, okay, I have to ease the tension a little more. And so I decided to focus on Imperial Aramaic and privileged depth over breadth. And so those of you who are here and interested in talking about the Levantine scripts or Epicoric Greek scripts or Anatolian scripts, I'll be happy to talk about that in the Q&A or maybe afterwards. But I think in the interest of time, I thought it best to focus on one major script family, the standard, and variations of that. So you'll please allow me to modify my title slightly by saying Tension, Standardization, and Variation in Encoding Ancient Iranian Scripts in Unicode in the interest of time. And again, 2 cases and 1 standard, Imperial Aramaic and 2 major derivatives of it in Central Asia. And this is a Sogdian ancient letter. This is a letter that was written in about 312 CE by a Sogdian woman who was living in Dunhuang in Turfan, in the oasis town there. And she was the wife of a Sogdian merchant. And her husband had left Dunhuang and gone back to presumably somewhere around Tashkent, modern-day Uzbekistan, and had left her there. And so in order to pay the bills, she basically became a servant in the household of a very wealthy Chinese merchant. And in this letter, she is telling her husband about how terrible life is here, how she doesn't like the food, the customs are really awkward to her, and how he abandoned her. And she says in this letter that she'd rather be the wife of a dog or a pig than be married to her husband. Unfortunately, this letter was found by R.L. Stein in the early 20th century in a bundle with about 10 other letters in a burlap mail bag that was stuck into the mailbox of a little encampment. And due to the dryness of the desert, these documents were preserved for 1,600 years and only with minor damage. So this is the translation of this, and this is where you see it right here. You know, surely the gods were angry with me the day I did your bidding. I'd rather be a dog's or a pig's wife than yours. And so poor Minwei, or Mune, never got the letter. Her husband never received it. We don't know what happened to her. But this is also exciting because this is probably an indication that she was literate and either was able to write herself or had a scribe do the writing for her. But we have no way of knowing that. In any case, I began to look at, to find out what can I find out about this script. I didn't know how to actually parse this, and when I was doing this Google research, I found that Nicholas Sims Williams of SOAS had done some transliteration of these letters. So I had a transliteration, and using this and some help from him, I was able to go back and kind of decipher this for myself before I was able to access the scholarly material that actually showed me what the letters actually meant. And when I was doing this, I looked up the Unicode website to see if there was indeed a Unicode encoding for Sogdian. I wanted to say to Nicholas that how about we take this transliterated text and actually put it, along with parallel text in the actual Sogdian script. But he mentioned to me that the script had not been encoded in Unicode, and at this point, it was not really on the roadmap or within the purview of the Unicode standard. So in August of 2015, I had Unicode add this as a tentative script that needed to be encoded. At that point, we just had one Sogdian script. And I figured, okay, why not use Imperial Aramaic as a way to represent the Sogdian script? When I was doing that research, I found out that transliterating Milne's letter from Sogdian into Aramaic, it caused the actual text to lose its essence. Because at that point, it was no longer Sogdian, but it was Imperial inscriptional Aramaic. And you couldn't capture the swashes and the emotion in the lettering in a script that was used primarily for edicts and proclamations. And here is an example of a Imperial Aramaic manuscript from Egypt and the letter from Central Asia. You can tell that even though the letters may be a little similar, there's a lot of distinction in how they're written, how the cursive is joined, and also a lot of the endings. So at some point, the idea occurred to me that maybe this needs to be a script that is encoded separately in Unicode and not using Imperial Aramaic. Imperial Aramaic, for those of you who don't know, is a very fundamentally important script for the history of writing, because it is the source from which all the Middle Eastern scripts, except for the cuneiforms, are derived. It's the source for all Central Asian scripts, and most likely for all the scripts of South Asia, and obviously our Latin alphabet. And it too is a variation of another standard, which is in Egyptian hieroglyphs through Proto-Canaanite or Proto-Sinaitic. But these are the letters in Imperial Aramaic. And going back to Sogdian, so Sogdian script is attested on three primary sources. The oldest are from Kultobe in Kazakhstan, and we have not been able to date those yet. The ancient letters are dated around 312, 314 CE, and then there are graffiti in northern Pakistan in Sogdian script. So this is an example of a Kultobe inscription. This is a regional variation of Aramaic that was used by Sogdian merchants, mostly for labeling houses, labeling places of worship, saying this belongs to so and so. And they used the Aramaic script because that's the script that was used by the Parthian chancery when the Parthians ruled most of Iran and parts of Central Asia. Their administration employed the Imperial Aramaic script because it was a standard that could be used all the way from the far eastern border of the Parthian Empire in Sogdiana and all the way over to Egypt. So they could transmit letters, and clerks and officiants could read documents without having to deal with translation and other problems in linguistic transmission. This is another ancient letter 1, written also in Dunhuang around the same time as Milne's letter. And then we have graffiti from the Upper Indus. And these graffiti were left by Sogdian pilgrims, most likely going from Central Asia, like Tashkent, Panjikent, down into the Swat Valley on pilgrimages related to Buddhist practices. And while they were there, they decided to leave their names. So a lot of these say so-and-so, son of so-and-so, as a way of for them to mark their territory and their presence. And I'm really impressed that these have survived to the present day. And while I was looking at the Upper Indus inscriptions, I found this script, Khwarezmian. Now, we're unsure what happened to Khwarezmian. It the script in the language abruptly stopped being used in the 11th century after the Arabs had the second invasion of that region. And Al-Biruni writes that the Arab conquerors didn't like the fact that they couldn't conquer the first time. So on their second campaign, they decided to kill all the scribes and scholars and burn every single manuscript that they could find written in this script. What survived were texts like this, which are ossuary inscriptions, or basically epitaphs written on gravestones. And these were written and buried, so they could not have been found, but there were about 100 of these found in the 1930s by Russian scholars, and only a few have been published or translated to date. But the script is very similar to Sogdian, and my question is how much of a variation in terms of standard is this? Is this a distinctive Sogdian, sorry, a distinctive Khwarezmian script used by speakers of Khwarezmian, and did they view it as being different from the script used by the Sogdians? Because they were living around the same time. This is another ossuary inscription, and you'll see that this is an example of the Indus Valley inscription. So if we go back and look at the letter that was written, we notice that the script was written horizontally, from right to left. And at some point, Sogdian pilgrims began to write the script vertically. So people were thinking, well, why is this stuff written from top to bottom and not from left to right? And this was a deliberate customization done by Sogdians after they encountered Chinese officials in Central Asia, because Chinese was a prestige language in the region, and in order to mimic the writing practices of the Chinese who typically write top to bottom, right to left, Sogdians decided to rotate their script 90 degrees counterclockwise and to write it this way. And what that resulted in at some point was a cursive joining script that people thought was written horizontally, but based on examples that we have that have Chinese seals on them, which are upright, we know that this manuscript was actually written vertically. So even though the script at some point was standardized by scribes for the transmission of Buddhist manuscripts and Manichaean manuscripts, they also decided to customize that standard by writing it top to bottom, right to left. And it began to evolve. This script was picked up by the Turks, or Turkic speakers, often conflated with Uyghurs, but from the Yenisei River area. They picked this up from Sogdians, who in turn looked to Sogdian as being a prestige literary language, and adopted their script, but they modified it by writing it, by making variations in the way that they wrote letters, by changing the endings of certain letters. So we have a continuum up to this point, from Aramaic, which was a script that was written, letters were written individually, unjoined, going to a script like the ancient letters where you see beginnings of cursive writing, all the way through to what they call the Sogdian Uyghur script, which emerged in about the 11th or 12th century, where things are deliberately joined, and there are certain rules to how you join and how you write letters at the end of words. So when I started working on this, I said, okay, well, if we want to encode Sogdian in Unicode, we have a Sogdian script, but how do we actually deal with this on a technical basis? Here are the Aramaic letters, here are the old Sogdian innovations, and then the further cursive Sogdian innovations. Now we see similar shapes in Sogdian isolated forms that can be traced back to the structure of the Aramaic forms. Like if you look at the first hey, for Old Sogdian, you can see how a scribe may have modified the Aramaic hey and added and maybe just rotated it out a little bit before joining it to the vertical stem. The wa was pretty similar. So in the notched head of the Aramaic waw gave way to a more open form. The kaf is pretty similar. The yod changed a little bit. The tet was dropped out. Same thing with the lamed. Lamed was inversed. And small other variations. But if we were to look at this, we could say, okay, we could reasonably say that Sogdian is a style or a variation of Aramaic. And in fact, when early researchers and developers of Unicode were looking at Sogdian, and this is a document from 2001 by Michael Everson, who did a lot of amazing work in script encoding, a document titled Road Mapping Early Semitic Scripts, in which he outlined all of these Semitic scripts that were not yet standardized and available for use on computers. He suggests that Aramaic could be considered a macro family of scripts, and that it has many descendants, including Mongolian and Brahmi, which are unique to merit their own encoding, but Aramaic encoding in Unicode could be used for all of the ancient Iranian scripts. Now, based on our understanding of the script here, we see that there is some tension here. On some level, the Sogdian scripts could be considered variants of Aramaic, but from a technical point of view, they're quite different. So the issue that I was faced with was, how do we encode Sogdian script? Do we consider it as Aramaic? So meaning, if we were to type these Sogdian texts, do we use the Aramaic characters, and then just change, and then just do a select all and do a font change to get our Sogdian script? Or do we separate it from Aramaic but come up with a single encoding so that we have one Sogdian encoding, and then we just do a font change again, but now at least we have Sogdian characters that are distinct from Aramaic? Or do we just separate all three so that we have an Old Sogdian encoding for the ancient letter type and then a separate one for the cursive Sogdian? So the primary differences between Sogdian and Aramaic have to do with the merger and the elimination of letters. The script itself, Aramaic script, is very small. It's 22 letters. And in Sogdian, 3 were dropped, bringing the total repertoire down to 19. From there, 3 more were merged. Dalet, Ain, and Resh were merged. So the repertoire kept shrinking. And to the point where there was a very limited number of signs representing the vast phonetic repertoire of Sogdian. So there were problems in terms of this, that not all Sogdian sounds could be represented distinctively using the Sogdian script. But this is an issue that we have in English as well. How many allophones of A do we have, but we still use a single letter representing all those? And then obviously there are cultural Scrabble divergences. And I'll show you some of those here. So going back to Ain. So Ain is a very, very special letter in Semitic languages. It represents the glottal stop. But in Sogdian, which is an Indo-Iranian language, that sound does not exist. So the Sogdians did not know what to do with this letter. Beyond that, the script of the Sogdians was very heavily inundated with what they call Aramaic heterograms, meaning there was a double code language in all of this. So that first letter, the first word you see there in these letters is the letter Ain and letter Dalet, which in Aramaic means ad, which means to, it's a salutation to somebody, like Od Bogu, like to master, so and so. But they didn't, Iranians, the Sogdians didn't say Od, they said ta. So whenever they would read this, they would write Ain Dalet, but they would pronounce it as ta. And various scribes said, okay, you know what? This is now a fossilized form in our script. And no one really cares if I write that last letter as a proper dalet, or if I join it, or if I just make it a squiggle. Because we all know that this means two. It's like the English ampersand, right? At some point, this ampersand originally was Latin E and T. Then we joined it in various different ways, and now we have a variety of ways in which we write the ampersand, but when we see it, we all know it means and no one says et anymore, right? So it's also a similar way of what we call heterography, of we write one thing, but we actually say something else when we write it. It's also very similar to the way that Jews write the name of God. They'll write Yahweh, but they'll pronounce it Adonai or something else because they don't want to say the word of God. I'm not Jewish, so nothing will happen to me in that sense. But so Ayin is a customization that I want to point out here. So Sogdian continued to diverge, and as it was picked up by the Turks, the Turkic speakers, it was also picked up by the original Uyghurs, who eventually took that script and refined it and standardized it, and began to do block printing in this script around the 10th or 11th century. And eventually, the Mongolians picked up the Uyghur script. So the legend has it that when Genghis Khan took over the empire, he had a Uyghur scholar, Tata Tunga, come to his court and invent a imperial script for the Mongol Empire. And Tata Tunga took his native Uyghur script and made some variations in the shapes and established the Mongolian script. The Mongolian script was further diverged later into the Manchu script and the Oirat script. And so we can keep going down the line to see all these variations, but at some point they all go back to Imperial Aramaic. But if we look at Mongolian and any of these letters, we can see that the orientation, that the structure, meaning how the script letters are joined together, the style of the script are very different from what the early Parthians did with Imperial Aramaic. And so that gets me to a conclusion that tension of standardization and variation pervades all of script encoding. And part of this has to do with the fact that there is no clear way to establish boundaries for certain ancient scripts. This is a major issue in Anatolian and in Mediterranean scripts, and in italic scripts. Like, how do we distinguish between various forms of Etruscan or of Latin, even various forms of Greek? These are all encoded within, let's say, the Latin alphabet or the Greek alphabet in Unicode. And if you want to, let's say, show an Ionian or an Achaean variant, then you have to show that through font changes. In order to represent scripts accurately in Unicode, we have to do very careful analysis of the deep and surface structures of scripts in order to understand their properties. Because as the Sogdian letters, they look very similar to Aramaic and to each other at a surface level if we were to write them in a chart. But when we actually look at the structure, letters change in later Sogdian. So when you have a letter at the beginning of a word, the middle of a word, or the end of a word, it changes shape, like the Arabic script, where you have initial, medial, and final forms. And the Sogdian development of these contextual positional forms occurred most likely independent of influence from the Arabic script, because the Arabic influence had not reached Central Asia by the time Sogdians had begun to write cursively. So there's a certain, maybe a human trend here for how we how we do variations of standard letters, even within words themselves. Maybe due to the mechanics, biomechanics of writing. And when we start a letter at the beginning of a word, we want to write it in a certain way, and when we end it, we want to have a slosh that goes upwards or downwards or that curls depending on the shape of the letter. The tension, as I've explained so far, for me, is a technical one as it relates to the Unicode standard. But as I mentioned earlier at the beginning, that there are cultural aspects of the tension as well. And part of my question with this is, when Sogdians were reading documents written by Uyghurs or by Turks, which are variations of their script, did they understand those to be the same script, or was it now a foreign or different writing system? And why did certain groups tend to privilege and choose certain styles or want to purposely create new styles as ways of distinguishing themselves from others? What were the drivers for those sorts of changes? Those are questions that, unfortunately, I can't answer and have been unable to answer so far. But in the end, Unicode exists to ensure uniformity of text interchange. The whole point of this is to say, okay, here we have a document, be it the letter from 312, or be it a Uyghur document written in the 14th century. The whole point is for us to be able to represent this uniquely on a computer. And if the way in which we are representing a script now means that we are incorporating its variant forms as customizations or variations of that script, but in fact, they need to be represented separately, as distinct from the original, then Unicode adapts to that requirement. And all of this is geared towards meeting the needs for scholars, and it's all based on new and emerging knowledge of scripts. So when Michael Everson wrote about unifying Aramaic or unifying Sogdian with Aramaic, at that point, we did not fully understand just how many scripts there were in Central Asia. We don't see Khwarezmian listed here. We don't see Uyghur listed here. At that point, the people who were working on Unicode, their knowledge of ancient and historical scripts and regional scripts was fairly limited. And the one thing that I've been very fortunate to do since I started working on Unicode, and I'm now one of the chief expanders of the standard, is by growing out that roadmap quite considerably. So when I was at Berkeley, I identified 156 scripts around the world that are not yet representable on computers. What that means, some of these are actual living scripts that are used by minority communities in Southeast Asia and Indonesia. What it means for people in those communities is that they are unable to use or type their native script for their language, so they use romanization instead. And that sort of customization, that forced adaptation of saying, okay, I cannot type in my native script, so let me use Latin alphabet to transliterate, is good in one sense that it promotes a modern approach to language that's practical. But from a humanistic point of view, it's also a leading cause of script demise and script death. Now, people will call it language death, language demise, because as I mentioned earlier, scripts are the ugly stepchild of linguistics, and people care more about the underlying sounds and grammar, and less about how those things are actually transmitted. And with that, I want to dedicate this talk to my friend Wang Siwei. Wang is a PhD student from Princeton who is currently imprisoned in Iran by the current regime. He was there doing research on 18th century Qajar administrative policy when he was picked up and charged wrongfully with espionage and looking to get secret documents to overthrow the Iranian regime. The people who in that regime have no idea what the Qajar dynasty was 200 years ago. The documents that he's looking for and that was studying have no bearing on the Islamic State. He's sitting there in Evin prison, and those of you in the UK may have heard of Nazanin as well. And they're all there together. And so I dedicate this to him. This guy is a big influence behind my interest in Central Asia. He's a former student of mine as well at the University of Washington. I was doing my MA there. And he speaks fluent Uyghur, Turkish, Farsi, Dari, Mandarin, Hindi, Urdu, Russian, and some other dialects of Central Asia. So thank you. I brushed through this quite quickly and wanted to keep it all within a 40-minute time frame. And I'm happy to take any and all questions that you may have.
Thank you, we may have some people may ask more sort of high-end and in-depth questions.
Absolutely.
I had a fairly small, sort of almost pedantic question, if you like. I was fascinated by the part of your talk where you were mentioning the period during the history of the Sogdian script where it started being written top to bottom, and you showed some examples of it. And what interested me was all the examples you showed were oriented as if it was written right to left. Mm-hmm. And I was a bit surprised that you didn't rotate them on the screen to make your point. So I had two questions relating to that, because you said that we knew that was written top to bottom because there were Chinese stamps on them which were oriented and could only be read that way around. Right. Does that tell us that it was written top to bottom, or that it was read top to bottom by the Chinese administrators with those stamps on it?
Yeah. So
the second question is just related to that is, if we did rotate this on the screen and looked at it that way, could we see any sign in the shapes of the letters that suggested that the paper was held that way around while it was written, that the serifs or other things might have been written in a top and bottom mm-hmm. dimension?
Absolutely. So when I started looking at ways to unravel the Sogdian script to understand it better, Nicholas Sims Williams from SOAS and also Yutaka Yoshida from Kyoto University in Japan were very instrumental in helping me understand that at some point Sogdians did begin to write vertically. And Dr. Yoshida actually has a paper called "When Did the Sogdians Begin to Write Vertically?" And he lays it all out. And in fact, he believes that this was also written vertically because it originates in China and not in Sogdiana in the Iranosphere, but more in the Sinosphere. And he says, okay, that this was written that way primarily because, where do I have that example in here of letter 3? Because here he says it can be one or the other. So there is that little footnote that is actually a note by the child to her father. So the question is here is that, and the reversal of this is blank. So a question that both Sims Williams and Yutaka Yoshida had was, which one of these is the right orientation? Is the marginal note the right orientation, or is the main body of the letter the right note? Or did the scribe at some point decide to, as an afterthought before sending it, the request was that my daughter wants to leave a note for her father too. The scribe may have just decided to quickly describe the same hand, yeah. So the issue is, your question is actually quite valid. If we were to look at this, there's no way of really knowing just by the actual ductus itself of, is this really vertical? And my question was very similar to yours. Like, if this letter here, I'll show you, this letter here is a hey. It represents a word final long vowel, mostly. If it's written vertically, for the scribe to curve that pen to go back up, to me doesn't make much sense biomechanically. I would want to see it go down and out. Very similar to what we see in Uyghur. And we know this is written actually. The reason why I didn't flip this is because I had this technical limitation of PowerPoint. I should have had it over there in the corner. but these seals are read right side up. And the Uyghurs, they always wrote this way. And Mongolian itself, even to this day, is written vertically. And you can tell by this here. The Mongolian, we see that the swash terminals, they go to the right or they go to the left. Or they curve, like in this here. Those are natural embellishments in that direction of writing. But in Sogdian, that backward curvature of that hey, to me seems very odd and kind of disagrees with that notion that this may have been written vertically, that the early script may have been written vertically. However, when you have these sorts of swashes, these are for the kaf. These could occur in vertical writing, but also in horizontal writing as well. But to me, just the way that the letters are shaped and curved kind of indicate to me that this original script was horizontal, because the script from which it derived, Parthian, was only written horizontally. And the later script, this, for example, could have also been written vertically, and is believed to have been written vertically. This is the Zoroastrian prayer, Hashem Bohu. Because you see these long striations, except for, again, in the hey, which is curved back. And to have that curved back seems kind of contrary to the notion of vertical writing. But I'm not an expert on on biomechanical ducti, so that's the best sort of answer that I can give you.
Thank you.
The other aspect of this vertical writing, we know it was written vertically because rocks don't move, right? These are large granite boulders on the bases of cliffs, and all around you see, here we have some vertical, and here we have some horizontal. So one question that I posed to Professor Sims William and Yoshida is, what if they were writing vertically because there was no space? Their response was, well, they probably would have written one word under the other instead of having to reorient the entire directionality of the script. I'm thinking from it as a native English speaker and someone who writes English, I'm not sure if I would write an entire text this way, but.
Do you get Greek graffiti written sideways?
Sideways, Boustrophodon?
Boustrophodon, which is certainly must be a very difficult thing. That's not the most difficult thing you could possibly do.
Of course, yeah.
I just can't imagine doing that.
Right.
I'm mostly, it's things that are being put onto an object of some kind that are sort of slowly.
Yeah.
But I can't think of anything except for acrostics.
There is an early Greek script, I think it's an inscription in the base of the British Museum. Now, it's an Ionian script or something, where they write like a plough. They go
yeah.
They don't always write left to right,
Right.
they do with Greek and Latin later.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very archaic.
Right.
So they don't carry on with that practice.
Right.
So maybe that's archaic, and Sogdian, they write the opposite way.
Right.
It doesn't make any sense. For example, the breaking across the Sogdians and 30th century.
Right.
And obviously it may have evolved up to late Roman times or 4th century.
Of course, yeah.
It's a full language. I don't know when Sogdian ends or when it starts.
Yeah, I believe it's around the 2nd century BC is when it becomes differentiated from Parthian. And then it goes up until the 11th, 13th century, and then the Sogdians disappear. And they become Uyghur or Turkic speakers at that point.
Because Alexander the Great, I know when I did studies on Alexander the Great, he conquered Sogdian.
Mm-hmm. Right.
In the 4th century BC. So you say they didn't have a separate script at that time?
But not by 4th century BC. Not that time. Yeah.
Although they were described as separate.
Mm-hmm.
So that's interesting. Separate people that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they were also defined in the inscription by Darius at Persepolis, when when he defines all the Aryan nations, and among them are the Sogdians and the Khwarezmians and the Medes, and goes through a list of all the separate nations that belong to this larger Arya notion. But yeah, wasn't Rukhsana Sogdian?
I believe so.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Or she would have spoken in a form of Persian.
right. Yeah, or maybe actually spoken Aramaic if she were from that elite level.
It's interesting because Christ spoke Aramaic. He was outside Israel.
Right.
In Norway.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, like this stuff is all fascinating, but like up until like 1920s, we had no idea that these documents even existed. And I mean, if Professor Sims Williams was not doing the work that he's doing for Central Asia, then we wouldn't have this information either. And even Dr. Vladimir Lipschitz, who was like the patriarch of Central Asian studies on the Russian side of things, he passed away last year. And he wrote extensively about Khwarezmian and about Sogdian studies, and a lot of the decipherment of the Sogdian documents, monuments that exist today are because of his efforts and the efforts of his students. And part of my interest in doing all this Unicode encoding is also this kind of an impetus of preservation. That this knowledge of these scripts is disappearing quite rapidly these days, and I have this kind of this arrogance that if I don't do it, then no one else will do it. And I mean, like there was a script. The Aramaic script that was used in Elamias, that had been on the Unicode roadmap since Unicode was established in the 1990s. And they almost removed it from the roadmap last year when I said, no, I want to work on this. And I did research and found 5 or 6 inscriptions that were very distinct from the original Aramaic, where the kings of Elam had decided to create a brand new script for their own inscriptions. And now Aramaic is encoded in Unicode. It'll come out in version 12, but that would have been gone by the wayside. And if people like me who don't care about, I mean, most people don't care about these obscure scripts. And luckily I was there to hold on to it and keep it, no matter how unimportant it is to anybody else. At least it's now preserved.
Just quickly, I'm just going to stop the YouTube broadcast.
Thank you, YouTube.
We don't, they were picking up most of what's going on.